You have surely heard the term audience before, and most likely it had something to do with TV. After all, it's one of the biggest and most studied audiences in the world. You might have also heard about it with, well, cinema and theater, although for the latter, you may also have heard or read the term spectators. First, let's check the lecture plan for today. First, I want to tell you a little bit about media theory and why I've started studying this. Then, we dive into the many concepts that exist that can be related or oppositional or complementary to our core concept of audience. Two of them that I'll be talking more in depth are publics and spectators, but I will be mentioning some other ones. Last, I also want to talk about the genealogy of audience studies. So let's take a step back. Why do we study media? Why did media studies started? Well, we can argue, for example, that one of the reasons is that media became too ubiquitous. Media is everywhere, and it's also very important to our daily life. And by media, I don't mean just social media, I don't mean just digital media. There's also some vintage media, and we've been always connected to media for a long time now. Some people will say that cave paintings were the very first form of media communication. And we see this stuff happening, right? Media, newspapers, radio, TV. We get curious. It was science that developed those things, and it's science that wants to also answer what are those things for? What can we use with it? Mankind is very curious, so we started asking questions. What can we do with media? Why people react in certain way when they watch a TV show? And another reason is that media became a very big business. And with business comes a lot of money and a lot of power, two things that mankind also seems to like a lot. And because there's money involved, it's even more important that we truly understand what media phenomena is. And one way of doing that is through audience studies. So why is it important to study media? Well, first, we want to better understand how to use media to communicate effectively to different audiences. But another aspect is that media theory and the understanding of society, they walk hand in hand. Historical shifts, different political contexts, our daily social interactions, what we talk with our friends on WhatsApp or during lunch, everything is both affected by media, but also we are able to affect media on a daily basis. For example, we can change the media discourse of a media conglomerate. We can claim for more diversity in movies, for example. Or we can create completely new media technologies that answer to the needs of a particular point in our history. We'll be able to discuss a bit more about that in the weeks to come. But what is our focus? Because of course, media studies is very, very vast. So our focus is two things, right? Media audiences and media effects, both of which are the name of the course. And especially, I want to talk more about the history of media audiences, so taking a more historical approach to it, where it started, where is it today, and also in terms of media effects, a quite critical approach to it, about the controversies related to measuring the effects of media. Full disclosure, I'm a fully qualitative researcher myself, and as such, I'm quite skeptical of media effects to an extent, although of course I value their contribution. There are studies that are extremely important in our field. But I'm not an expert in media effects in terms of quantitative media effects. Rather, I'll be talking more in this course about media audiences, and together with qualitative methods. And then we'll be talking more about media affects rather than media effects. And I hope that by the end of the course, you'll be able to differentiate those two terms and what is the validity of both media effects research, but also research on media affects. Now, a second part of this lecture of today, we talk a bit about this complicated matter of academic concepts. Not the easiest thing out there, I agree. And especially when we're talking about these concepts that are related to groups of people in relation to media use, to media consumption. There are so many names that we can use for them. Publics, audiences, spectators, the mass from the mass media, crowds, viewers, users. Well, let's talk a little bit about two of those here today. The first I want to talk about is spectators. For instance, very often we see those attending a football match being called the spectators of that game. However, as an academic concept to understand media and communication, it's now very rarely used in academia because it presupposes a passive behavior from the individual, someone that's just spectating, just sitting there, spectating something, and therefore has no agency in their consumption of media. We can see why it doesn't work that well. In terms of theory, we have moved from the hypodermic needle theory of direct effects to way more interesting ones, and now to an explosion of different media perspectives. What matters is we are not just spectators. We have agency. We can select what we consume and when we consume, even though sometimes this choice may feel like a bit of an illusion. Surely, we gotta contextualize these choices within the current economic systems we live in, the current cultural systems we live in, and that's where cultural studies comes into play, and we'll see that more further ahead. For example, we can look at the myriad of streaming services now offered to us that in a way both creates financial burden on one hand because we have to pay for all of those, but on the other hand also creates cultural expectations of consumption, such as this one. Hey Paula, have you seen that brand new series that's like Dutch, Finnish, Vietnamese, and it's like sci-fi stuff that's going on Netflix? It's like mind-boggling. I'm not really into series. I'm more like a book person. What? You haven't seen it? Oh, come on, you're so early 2020. No, I do not intend to become a TikToker. A second concept that I want to address today is the one of Publix, a concept that, in my opinion, really addresses the matter of agency. Now, Publix as a theoretical concept is not necessarily linked to media, although in this day and age, basically everything is related to mediated communication to an extent. Rather, the concept is most often utilized to talk about people's involvement in political matters, and especially when we think about social movements, political movements, and etc. There are several definitions of Publix out there from important authors such as John Dewey and Hannah Arendt, and also a handful of more specific concepts, specific approaches to Publix, such as the idea of networked Publix developed by Dana Boyd, or the effective Publix developed by Zizi Papacharisi. In more general terms, we can talk about Publix as the gathering of people that were affected by something. So you were affected by something that happened in the world and you get together because of that, because you share something in common. And this affectation can be a direct affectation or an indirect affectation. And because of this, because you as an individual and then as a collective were affected by something, you act. You don't just passively receive that, but you act based on it, such as the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement. We can also see that when people mobilize themselves for an election or feel connected to each other by their object of fanish desire, is what we say. And sometimes it leads to what we call fan activism, as you can see in the slide in an image about the protest that happened in Chile. Surely the concept of Publix has way more nuance than what I just briefly mentioned here, but if you're interested in learning more about it, you can ask me, but I'll also leave some reading suggestions on Canvas. I'm tired. Are you tired? I've been talking for such a long time. I imagine you are. So let's take a short break, grab a chocolate, maybe a cup of tea, or espresso to keep you awake. Come back in like 5 or 10 minutes. When you're relaxed, I'll still be here.
75 years later.
Now for the last part of this video, let's talk about the genealogy of media audiences. Now our core concept finally, right? Audiences. As any academic term is full of controversies, there's some plot twists in its history, new approaches that appear all the time, and of course a pinch of competition over the best way to study them. In this course, you'll be able to see a very nice movement that encompasses some of the main audience research approaches. Now, very briefly, because I don't want to spoil all the fun now, this is a bit of the concept and its research field genealogy. Because alongside changes in how we define audience, we also had changes in how we study them. For instance, it all started with the idea that the audience was very passive, that we had no agency about it. But it soon changed, and we started thinking about media having limited effects on people. So media is not manipulating us. So at some point, people said like, well, people actually have more of an agency in it. And then that's when it came up with the theory of uses and gratifications, which we're going to talk about more next week. After that, it became more and more common to talk about a very active audience, an audience that participates. And nowadays we can say that there is a participation paradigm that it's very evident and very important in audience studies. So we're constantly going back and forth between this idea of active audience and maybe participatory audiences and etc., which doesn't mean that we stopped, for example, doing uses and gratifications research. But can you see here how we go from a very passive idea of audience, so the couch potato audience, we're just sitting there passively absorbing everything, but now audiences participate in media creation. And that's a big change, not just in terms of society behavior, but how we as researchers understand the audiences. This is one of my favorite definitions of audience to this day. I find that it encompasses a lot of what we understand as audience nowadays. But let's take a quick look at it. They say audience are first social actors, which means that audience acts in society. The concept gives agency to an audience that was initially thought of as spectators, as very passive. Then the concept talks about attending, negotiating meaning, something that we're going to highlight even more when we discuss the cultural studies approach. Last, the concept tackles the participation of audiences in media creation, a topic we will discuss in depth as well in two different opportunities. So first, when we discuss the theory of participation paradigm in week 3 by Sonia Livingston, and we get back to it in week 6 to talk specifically about fans, fandoms, and fan practices, as fans are a very particular, very unique kind of audience. So today we learned a bit about media theory and why studying media is relevant. We also learned a bit of like siblings, parent concepts related to audiences. And finally, we had a first look at the genealogy of audience studies and the definition of audience itself. What's next? I might be missing something that I did not mention here. Well, it's media effects, and you know what's coming.